Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's Institute Talk. I'm Tejasvi from Public Relations Office. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Jahnavi Phalkey, the founding director of Science Gallery, Bengaluru, and Infosys Prize 2023 winner in Humanities. Dr. Phalkey was awarded the Infosys Prize for her brilliant and granular insights into the individual, institutional, and material histories of scientific research in modern India. Her book, The Atomic State, offers fascinating insights into the everyday lives of science and its practitioners. In this lecture, Dr. Phalkey will talk about her research in histories of nuclear research, statistics, and aeronautics. She will explore the claim that state formation and knowledge making were inextricably intertwined in the middle decades of the 20th century. The Infosys Prize lecture series is intended as a platform for the Infosys Prize laureates to speak about their award-winning research to a wider audience of research scholars and students. The lectures are meant to spark conversations and enable an exchange of ideas among the scholarly community and aspiring researchers. The Infosys Science Foundation, which gives the Infosys Prize, was set up in 2009. The Infosys Prize is an annual award to honor outstanding achievements of researchers and scientists in 6 categories: economics, engineering and computer science, humanities and social science, life sciences, mathematical sciences, and physical sciences. From 2024, the ISF is moving in a new direction and awarding early career researchers aged 40 years and below. The foundation works with communities of students, educators, and others to create conversations around science and research. The foundation is attempting to foster dialogue around science and society through talks, workshops, initiatives, performances, and other events. I would now request Sumit to play a small, short introductory video. I would now request Dr. Phalkey to begin with her talk.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for showing up. It is my pleasure to share my research with you. And I think we do not do enough history of science in India, history of science and engineering, or science and technology, and that has consequences. We'll speak about some of those later, but allow me to share my research with you after that embarrassing review. So I'll speak to science and state formation, and at the end of it arrive at 3 main observations that I want to make about why this is not only interesting but important for all of us to understand, especially on premises like this, in the context of the kind of research but also training and education that we can have here. So, I don't need to remind anyone of anything like this because I'm pretty sure everyone in this room has seen Oppenheimer. So, 1939, and I always mix the 2 Ottos, so I wrote it down. The Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann basically bombarded the uranium nucleus to unsettle it and arrive at uranium unstable isotopes. Shortly thereafter, Otto Frisch and Lisa Meitner aunt and nephew, wrote a paper about nuclear fission. This sets the context for many of the discussions and the trajectories of institutions in India of science and engineering, which we will discuss going forward. Now, Lisa Meitner and Otto Fischer's paper comes at the dawn, or at very much at the threshold of the beginning of the Second World War. And what that means is the rest of us, the rest of the story is very clear to us, and I don't have to repeat it very much because the letter that Einstein wrote to Roosevelt led to the establishment of the Manhattan Project. But what's important to see here is Robert J. Oppenheimer, who all of us now know about, but Ernest Lawrence, who we also saw in the film, who made to work the cyclotron principle to effectively spherical acceleration of particles. And the largest example of the cyclotron that we know today is CERN in Geneva, which again I'd like you to bear in mind as we go forward this afternoon. So Lawrence is critical to the story because here's Lawrence sitting in his laboratory, Oppenheimer sitting in Los Alamos. But together, their work decided how physics, but also some other disciplines, would come to be conducted in the aftermath of the Second World War. Here we have a discussion of, and you might read it, you might not read it, the references there. Lawrence and Oppenheimer are working very closely with each other, but what's of interest to us is that Lawrence is using the cyclotron, which later came into the service of the Manhattan Project, which would then create the atomic bomb, to do fundamental research in isotopes. His brother, John Lawrence, is a medical doctor. The funding for the cyclotron comes on the basis of an argument that cyclotrons would allow for the development of radiotherapy, which would be extremely useful in hospitals, especially for cancer treatment, but also radiation therapy for other conditions. And what might be interesting to this audience also to note is that one of the applications that John Lawrence makes is to the Tata Foundation, which is funding leukemia and other kinds of cancer research across the world at that point of time. So here is a conversation between what's happening in the lab, what one might actually in common parlance call fundamental research, and what one might actually look at as probably the most path-breaking, shape-shifting project of the middle decade of the 20th century with economics. And this conversation in fact belongs very much in there. These details matter only to the extent that many of you are probably far more familiar about this in depth than even I am at this moment. But what I'd like us to note is the magnitude of the budget, the number of the people involved, and also how the Manhattan Project changes the nature of the relationship between scientific research and it also changes the nature of the kind of funds that would be required for fundamental research after the war. There are, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak largely about my first research for which which was recognized by the prize, but also speak about two other projects that I've carried out since. One of them slightly more than the other, so Aeronautics and Statistics. But allow me to now speak about three laboratories in India that were trying to establish experimental nuclear physics, starting around the same time as Berkeley, as Cavendish, as Göttingen, as Paris. So Meghnad Saha in the mid-1930s is actually at the University of Allahabad, as some of you already know, and he is leading, together with his students, in fact, one of the earliest wireless laboratories in India, to study wireless. And in the mid-1930s, he finds himself in conversation with people at the Niels Bohr, people who are working with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. Niels Bohr, a theoretical physicist, is also working hard on getting a cyclotron or a spherical accelerator for his laboratory, for the center in Copenhagen. And that intrigues Meghnad Saha because he also is a theoretical physicist, an astrophysicist. And he's convinced that that is the path to follow if one wanted to do cutting-edge research at the frontier. So 1930 is the birth of nuclear physics. 1932, in fact, is the Actus Mirabilis. That's when the discipline sets sail. And in the mid-1930s, Meghnad Saha is in conversation with people in Copenhagen and he realizes that he also needs help in Calcutta. If the department, at that point in Allahabad, but he soon moved to Calcutta. In Calcutta, if physics in India is to stay at the frontiers. He writes many letters, among others to the Birlas, but also to the Tatas. And the letter that goes to the Tatas, in fact, is written by Jawaharlal Nehru, who is at that point in prison. So there's a wonderful exchange between the two of them. Where Nehru then writes a letter to the Durabdata Trust stating that this is the frontier of physics, this is the new knowledge that we must know. And the argument, like John Lawrence and Thomas Lawrence, is that of medical physics. And what they attach with the letter is a newsletter of the Rockefeller Foundation, where they are stating why they would fund research based on with a cyclotron. Saha then, in the late 1958, just before the outbreak of war, sends a student of his from Allahabad, Basanti Dulal Nath Chaudhary, or B.D. Nath Chaudhary, as some of the senior members in this audience might know him as. He sends him to Berkeley to study with the cyclotron engineers. So effectively in the 1930s and 40s, what we hear from anyone who tries to build a cyclotron after Lawrence establishes that one can build a cyclical accelerator in 1953, people go to Berkeley to learn how to build, maintain, and run a cyclotron. It was like, and if you just remember the first image, that's the kind of factory-like routine and people and engineers and technicians and everybody that one needs to maintain, to build, maintain, and run a cyclotron and do experiments. So, Meghnad Saha's dream is that Basanti Dulal Nath Chaudhary or B.D. Nath Chaudhary would go to Berkeley, understand what it takes to build and run a cyclotron, come back and establish a cyclotron in Calcutta. There are interesting stories. I'm not going to go into deep details about each of the stories, but I'm happy to take them up during the question and answer session. And what we see then is a correspondence that develops between Meghnad Saha and Ernest Lawrence to send parts of a cyclotron, of various parts that are required to build a cyclotron to Calcutta during the war. So we have a 50-ton magnet current from California to Calcutta. We have a port that is bringing the oscillators and the vacuum tube that gets sunk by Japanese torpedoes, as a result of which Meghnad Saha and Nath Chaudhary and his colleagues start building these missing parts using war surplus materials in Calcutta, so on and so forth. They start the work on it. So this is the first laboratory in India, starting in the late 1930s, but most certainly during the war, and in full knowledge of the Manhattan Project, building, because as one can imagine, if Nath Chaudhary was in Berkeley between 1938 and 1941-42, then he's fully aware of what's actually happening in the Manhattan Project or in the Berkeley laboratory in relation to the war or the Manhattan Project. The second effort is led in Bangalore by C.V. Raman, the country's at that point, and today, only science Nobel laureate, who also, and makes an interesting argument, saying every civilized country has a cyclotron, India must also. So basically, we also need to join the ranks of equals among equals in conducting basic research in physics, and therefore Bangalore, being the place where he was, and of course leading the country's, in many ways, most eminent department of physics, would want to create a facility. What he does is, around the same time, send another student of his, Rappal Sangameswara Krishnan, or R.S. Krishnan, as many of them know him, to the Cavendish. Now, it is in the Cavendish that the first splitting open of the atom, the experiment of the splitting open, to split open the atom was conducted. The lab is still led by Rutherford. Krishnan finds himself at wartime again, like B.D. Nath Chaudhary, in a Cavendish. But unlike Berkeley, Cavendish is starved not only of resources but also of people. What happens at Cavendish is that people like John B. Cockcroft and others have moved to Chalk River or the Canadian part of the Manhattan area, as a result of which Krishnan is leading the maintenance, at times building and training using the cycle. He reports discoveries of about 9 isotopes, and he also, in fact, he loses one of his students to an air raid because it's wartime. And what we should take note of here is that Krishnan learns how to build and maintain a cyclotron because he is in fact leading the lab in the absence of the leading physicists working at this time and so on. Third person finds himself in Bangalore at the Indian Institute of Science, also at the Indian Institute of Science during the war. For part of the time that he is there, he's waiting to go back to Bombay. Sometime during the war, C.V. Raman nominates him for a fellowship of the Royal Society, and with that kind of a rapport that he is building with the Department of Physics and C.V. Raman there, he sets up a cosmic ray research unit. Also because there are people from Caltech, Robert Millikan in particular, who are, during the war again, in Bangalore to conduct experiments in cosmic physics. Why? Because southern part of India, the southern peninsula of India, is very close to the geomagnetic equator, which allows for better observations, so on and so forth. So here we are, two leading figures. Now, Homi Bhabha, of course, is at his own discipline at the threshold of physics. Cosmic ray physics, one would say that cosmic ray physics study particles in the atmosphere, and experimental nuclear physicists using particle accelerators try to study similar properties and particles inside the laboratory setting. Now, of course, some of you in the audience might not know this. You can use that some of you might not know. So, what Homi Bhabha does at this point of time is he is also, like the other two figures, in touch with people who understand the undergoing shifts, the undergoing changes in the practice of physics and the kinds of budgets and the deeply embedded state interest in what's coming. So towards the end of the war, this is about 1943-44, he floats the idea for the establishment of the data of what today is the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. While at the Indian Institute of Science, he has, of course, support by way of funding from the Tatas, to whom he is distantly, not so distantly related. But also, he proposes a model of an institute that is at the heart of it dedicated to physics and mathematics research, in line with the horizon that is quickly taking shape towards the end of the war. More on that in a second, because at the end of it, I'm going to tie all this together to speak about why this matters for forward. So what we find is that even before India is independent, so there is this coincidence of the first use of atomic weapons in 1945 and Indian independence, which comes barely 2 years after that, or actually 2 years and a week after that. And therefore, we find that this coincidence begins to shape the agenda of the new state that has been formed. Already in 1946, even before independence, an atomic energy regulation is formed. Now, it is almost always called Atomic Energy Commission. So you see that in the United States, you see that in the United Kingdom, everywhere else. But what we're talking about is always regulation and formation of state agencies on the threshold of dual use. Because if you know how to do one, you know how to do the other. So in 46, we have an agency that is being formed. That agency, in fact, takes the decision on which of these three laboratories would survive and walk into Free India as the chosen facility for conducting research in physics, in fundamental physics, related to the creation of either nuclear energy or, at that point, not quite realistic an assumption, nuclear weapons. The committee that was formed was called the Taylor Committee, and Professor Taylor at that point was teaching at Wilson College in Bombay. And the verdict, so to speak, on the couple of proposals, one from Calcutta, where Meghnad Saha by now are close to independence now, proposes the establishment of an independent institute called the Independent Institute for the Study of Nuclear Physics, or Institute of, and Raman and Krishnan continue to argue for experimental nuclear physics within a physics department at the Indian Institute of Science, and Bhabha places on the table a new institution that will allow for research across both the fundamental particle physics and higher energy physics, and also its application. Between 1946 and 1954, the ambitions of the three, one would say that the ambitions in Calcutta are clear. They want to establish an experimental nuclear physics facility. The ambitions in Bangalore are also clear. They also want to establish a similar facility. The ambitions in Bombay are different. Why are they different? Because as it begins to emerge that Bombay might be the chosen facility, Bhabha's request for funding to a transitioning economy from wartime to independence is to acquire a piece of land. People around him, including Raman, argue that he wants this particular equipment in order to create in the laboratory a particular particle, the meson, in order to get the Nobel Prize. So up until 1953-54, when this research is being carried out simultaneously in other laboratories, in Berkeley as well as in Bristol, which is Paul, Bhabha is pursuing this line of research and the acquisition of apparatus that is relevant to this research. Once that ambition is thwarted by both the observation and discovery of the particle elsewhere, in 1954, we see in many ways hang up the publication date, so to speak. The Department of Atomic Energy was formed, and we find Homi Bhabha pouring himself almost entirely into, while he does continue to organize conferences with people, and therefore all the development and growth of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, but the development of the atomic energy establishment from the AWP or PARC as it is called today, or Bhabha Atomic Research Center, starts taking speed in ways in which it did not before 1954. So the ambitions of the people who wanted to establish nuclear physics in India, experimental nuclear physics in India, coming from different places. There are at least 3 places that try to do this. The first use of atomic weapons, but also the arrival of an independent state, in many ways decides who will be able to do this research and who will not be able to do this research. So the Taylor-Bhabha report that I alluded to a few seconds ago effectively says that the priority for nuclear research in this new country would be with Bombay, cannot be with Bangalore, and cannot be with Calcutta. This has been interpreted and read by historians, but also by policymakers in 2 ways. One is that this was a result of one might call proximity to power, proximity to funding, but also an argument about centralization. And I'll speak to both for a few seconds before I move on. There is no doubt that Homi Bhabha had access to funding, but there was funding also at the Indian Institute of Science, and in Calcutta also they had garnered enough funding to be able to establish a department or a cyclotron facility. The change scale of research and the change rigor of research meant that this had to be thought through again. And at the moment when this had to be thought through again, which was basically between 1945 and 1997, Homi Bhabha's idea is more aligned, appears to be more aligned, or was seen to be more aligned, or was read to be more aligned with what a newly formed state might want. Continuing experimental nuclear physics in a university laboratory at the scale at which it would be possible to do was not going to be useful for purposes. This is something that is critical to understand. The second part of this argument is one of sentimental. It is often argued that not only did atomic energy, the establishment of the apparatus or state agencies around atomic energy, not only did they shape the two departments, the two eminently funded departments, I can say, which is the Department of Atomic Energy and Space, but also how science and the rest of the country is funded otherwise. And I think one might want to retreat back from that kind of an argument to examine why centralization was not. The easiest reading of that decision is one where India was a resource-strapped country at that point in time, and to fund key facilities at the scale required would have been difficult. The second reason is that this is also the kind of research that was being conducted in an atmosphere of extremely strong exposure. And therefore, the exchange of knowledge was also not easy. So bringing people together in one place was thought to be a better argument. To lay into context the decision that was taken at this point in time, if you look at what happened in the United States, Argonne National Lab, Brookhaven National Lab, where several universities came together to conduct this research. It was no longer possible, even in a less resource-strapped context, to continue this kind of research in a single university setting, or if a consortia was important. But if you look at war-ravaged Europe, the answer was CERN. 1956 is when the footing for CERN was laid. So it was not even possible for war-torn smaller nations in Europe to do this kind of research on their own. It was required, of course, for both reasons. One was just to be able to fund it, but the other was also the visibility that the Americans wanted on who was doing what and what was it doing. And of course, CERN also comes in after 1955, which is when the Atoms for Peace, first Atoms for Peace conference was held. Only Jahnavi, the president of that, presided over that meeting, where the Indian delegation, young as the country was, barely 10 years old, took 13 papers, all developed on facilities at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research from a off-the-shelf particle accelerator. But that's a story for another day. Allow me to move. So these are the agencies, the state agencies that got created at that point in time. There are two specific things that I want us to note here and bear them in mind before we move forward. One is that the first state agency for the regulation of research in nuclear physics or atomic research was under the Council for Scientific and Research, or CSIR. The second thing that I want us to note is that a portfolio for science and technology was barely found in any country before the Second World War. After the Second World War, you barely find a country without a portfolio. That's India, of course, that was held by the government for the first 20 years, but also for much of the period after that too. It's in 1971 that the Ministry of Science and Technology established the Ministry by the Prime Ministers. Allow me to take you to a completely different setting now, but it's still the Second World War because we're in the middle decades of the 20th century, which is where I'm most comfortable. Some of you might know this figure. Kurt Tank, who was the aircraft designer and also the test pilot for many of the Copperware planes that were used in war. That's him. I'll try to again cut a long story short, happy to take questions about it later. At the end of the Second World War, as many of us know, entire laboratories and manufacturing facilities, especially in dual-use technologies, were picked and taken away by either the occupying Allies or the Soviet Union. And the Phalkey facility was one such facility in the training center. And Kurt Tank was approached by both the British as well as the Russians to take 45 of his men, they were all men, to either Russia or Soviet Union or the United Kingdom. The story goes, and I have no evidence for this, I've only read this coming through the archive, Most of it is held at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. The story goes that he negotiated with both, said yes to both, took some money from the Soviet Union and then disappeared. Disappeared to the Vatican. From there, 45 of his people got passports and showed up in Cuba, where they worked with the Juan Perón regime to build Phalkey. 2, maybe 3 exemplars of this airplane were built. It was meant to be a supersonic jet fighter. That would have been the most cutting-edge design at that point of time for an aircraft, for a fighter aircraft. Argentina simply did not have the resources to make multiple numbers of this plane, but also to manufacture this at the capacity at which it was designed, both in terms of materials, but also especially engines. It is interesting that many of the test reports on the materials, but also the experiments in the wind tunnel, etc., are from Swiss labs in Germany. Clearly, the reports are going back and forth and being read by Kurt Tank, who's working closely with a French engineer in Argentina. Before I speak about this man, Kurt Tank, in 1956, when it became possible for many of the what one might call mercenary emigres to return back to Germany, Kurt Tank and 18 of his men returned to Munich, which is where he was from. Well, his men went all over, but he went to Munich. And as the story goes, in a decadent party just outside, decadent in my word, outside of Munich, in a castle, he met the Indian Minister for Defense Production, who invited him and his men to India to build India's supersonic jet fighter. 13 of his men at Kurt Tank came to India in 1907 and worked in the facilities that were designed during the war as a collaboration with the newly formed, and the Department of Aeronautics at the Indian Institute of Science was formed during the war for war purposes. Phalkey had studied at the University of Göttingen and studied with Ludwig Prantl, who is known to be the founder of the study of aerodynamics. And Phalkey came back. He designed the HT-2 or Hindustan Trainer 2, which was the first Indian designed aircraft and manufactured at the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, all of which is between 1940 approximately and 1944-45. 10 years later, we have Kurt Tank and his men showing up at the same facilities, working with Phalkey and his people, who are following things that Phalkey has learned. There are other stories that connect it to Germany, but that's not of relevance to today's story. And they work in Phalkey's lab. They used the first wind tunnel that was made at the Indian. It was made and used at the Indian Institute of Science, which was built by Oskar Titiens, who also happened to be a student of Ludwig Prantl, but who escaped Germany for reasons other than those that Kurt Tank has Germany for. And those are the labs where Kurt Tank and his men test India's first supersonic jet fighter. It's called Marut. You see that it takes flight in 1962. The pointer works. Some of you might recognize the stage. The man from the first story, Baba, went for the test flight of Marut. It's interesting that the facilities that are built by those escaping Germany are then used by those escaping Germany for another reason in the 1940s, but that both are welcome in India. And why is that relevant? Why one might look at it? So, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, earlier Aircraft Limited, the Department of Aeronautics and the National Aeronautical Laboratory, now Aerospace Laboratory, all belong in this story. These are agencies that are created not only for the regulation and manufacture, but also for the organization of research and funding of research in aeronautics, which laid the foundations for NAL then becoming one of the many, many labs that feed into the support system for the Indian space program. It's a big jump, I know, but I'm happy to answer some of the details as we might have some time for questions. So the first story I've written about in the book that was mentioned already, which is the beginnings of experimental atomic experimental nuclear physics in India. I also ended up making a film because I had studied 6 instead of 6 labs. I ended up writing about 3. This film is in fact about the world's oldest functional particle accelerator, which happens to be, can anyone take a guess where it is? I'm sure some of you know it. So it's a particle accelerator that was transferred to Chandigarh. Doesn't have relevance to think about the state, but otherwise important. I'll speak a little bit to the last project that I started a while ago, but then I truncated it to move to Bangalore and help establish and design a new institution. I hope to get back to it and write about it someday. This is about a statistical method, T2, that many, again, in this room might be familiar with. Now, why is this important? I'll plot it for you. Some of you, again, might already know about this. And in this case, probably better than I do, because as I said, I've completed my research on this project for a while, but I'll get back to it. Now, here's the thing. In 1947, at independence, there is a new country which has access to data that has been generated under imperial government, or under imperial governance, and there is a requirement for different kinds of data to set up state agencies and state services. China in 1949 faces a similar question. Both take very different paths. The Chinese go for 100% census. The consequences of that are studied very well, and in fact, a brilliant book by Aeronautics, Making Things Count, that came out recently, speaks of what happened with the adoption of that particular route to data collection in China. India went the random sampling. T2 as a method was developed by Mahalanobis in the 1930s. He used it, he and his colleagues, at first what was called the Statistical Laboratory and later the Indian Statistical Institute, used this method to study everything from agricultural experiments to population census to a range of other industrial data sets. This method, and because of the familiarity with it, but also the finesse with which the statisticians at the Indian Statistical Institute were able to use this method, meant that random sampling as a method became India's, well, T2 and its ancillary became India's contribution to the frontier for statistical. To the extent that we had not only the Chinese but also others coming to India to study what the Indians were doing experimentally to make T2 as reliable and robust as possible, which led to the establishment of the National Sample Survey Organization, a state agency to support the collection of data, and its processing, of course, for the longest time was being carried out at the Indian Statistical Institute in China. Now, the period that I'm speaking about saw India transitioning to T2. One is India's transition in terms of governance from being an empire, because it was always the dominions, colonies, and the British Empire, and British Indian Empire. So India's transition from being empire to independent country. It was also a transition of the world order as we knew it from European imperialism to the Cold War, and led by a tussle between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the politics of also technical aid that came along with it. And I mean, we are on a campus that is a part of that story as well. This campus is funded by the Soviet Union. So export controls became the norm in very, very strong ways. I mean, to the extent where, for example, early on in the late 40s and early 50s, one couldn't even buy silk balloons for custom experiments because the United States, where most of the balloons came from, decided that that was something also to be used, potentially be used for spying, And the third was also of the transition of certain kinds of research from tabletop experiments to larger equipment systems, or what has been called big science, where you have massive apparatuses, expensive apparatuses, which of course also lock people into research technology. And therefore, if you know, essentially, if you have a hammer, you're going to go looking for a nail and a thing, and so you bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and so, you continue to use the same methods, so lots of technologies. But large systems, we had large data sets before that we used in astronomy or weather or any other studies or research. But large equipment systems came into force of came and norm after the Second World War, and the Manhattan Project has contributed. And that Indian independence comes exactly at this threshold, meant that in many ways, the lens through which the infrastructure for both the regulation and establishment of the most important funding of the by this moment. I already spoke about centralization. Yeah. One major important consequence of the Cold War for science everywhere is that competition between nations became deeply embedded in their ability to do research and deliver on that research, and the ability to do research also in the engineering sciences and deliver on that too. What do I mean by that? After the first use of atomic weapons, the Americans did not expect the Soviet Union to be able to have a nuclear weapon anytime soon. The first tests in 1949 came as a surprise to the Americans, which meant that the borders on or the controls on knowledge exchange became stronger. 1955, atoms for peace, the doors began to open, and in 1957 the Soviets launched Sputnik. That came not as a surprise but as a shock to many people in the United States, because it meant that here was a power that could act. And so you have then American investment increasing in science and engineering across the world, especially in Europe but across the world. Isidore Rabi's argument for American investment in CERN was that we need people to talk to. We can't be talking to ourselves. And so after Sputnik, you have John F. Kennedy declaring a national anthem, putting a man on the ground. And that, in many ways, embodies what the Cold War was, essentially a competition in the ability to produce new science and new engineering and embedded state structures, dual-use structures. All of this was happening as India was becoming more and more independent, but more and more a global player, so to speak, or seeking her place as a global player, and therefore had to find a voice within this discourse on science and engineering. And that, in many ways, has shaped the kind of research we found, but the kind of patterns that we see in state funding of research. With that, I will stop and answer the questions you might have.
Hi. So one of the questions that I think I've always had is with regards to basically, I presume calling it a misstep, no one in this room would argue with that, the misstep of not having invested enough in primary education. And so what I wanted to know, so there was kind of this Nehruvian government for dozens of years, which basically, of the many, many good things that they did, this was one of the things that, public health and public education investment. So what I wanted to know was, did big science and the kind of push towards the kind of agencies that have been set up and the kind of funding that has gone into it, did this play a role in them justifying to themselves, the government at some level justifying to itself, where the resources for science and technology were being spent, and hence how they would argue with themselves about where it was not being spent, or was this two disconnected independent decisions that were arrived at? So in essence, what I'm asking is, did the push for big science affect the way public policy elsewhere was conducted, or were these two things independent entities which are operating?
Yeah, for everything that you do, there's something else you cannot do, and that's true for both resources and time. And I think these decisions are very deeply informed. The major debate in the 40s, which returned with a vengeance at least rhetorical vengeance in the 80s, was the Gandhian argument, right? Like build down up versus the order of the day, so to speak, right? Like during the Cold War. And I think there is no doubt that India was a resource-strapped country. There's no doubt that there was debt recovery that never did quite happen in the way it should have, because the United Kingdom, for example, was one that owed India a massive amount of sterling pounds, and also India lost several men in the war, and so there are consequences to all of this. Right? So, but the question you're asking is one of whether this was a choice. These were choices, and I think the language or the vocabulary, not language, the vocabulary of defense and therefore the vocabulary of independence and therefore of defense was one that I think the leadership was not willing to innovate much from. Right? Like if you wanted to be a nation, if you wanted to be a country, and India was punching way above its weight in the first 20 years after independence. Right? Like you're going and giving 8-hour-long speeches in the United States. So I think that the refusal to ally to either side in any strong manner, in any clear manner, the desire and the need to protect freedom at, I wouldn't say every cost, but at reasonable cost, was something most people at that point were convinced across borders, right? Like whether you look at industrial leadership, intellectual leadership, political leadership, I think that argument was a difficult one to fight. Because after emerging from about 300 years of imperial rule, there was a hard argument to fight. And it was very clear what was happening with, if you just look at this period, right, like 1956 is the Suez War. You have the Korean War. I mean, effectively, as some of my colleagues would say, it was hardly a Cold War. It was cold probably in Europe and North America, but not practically anywhere else. I mean, the AK-47 became the symbol of the Cold War in Afghanistan, but also in large parts of Africa. So, in this context, where regimes are being overthrown for different reasons, right? Like whether you look at what happens in parts of Africa which begin to become independent only in the 60s, but also in Latin America, it becomes, I think the priorities kind of become very, very clear to the leaders. And now one can argue with that, but those are the priorities they decided on, and they went ahead with it, and that came at a cost, because India still is in fact a resource country. That's probably my slightly wrong. It doesn't mean the questions weren't debated. They were hard questions, they were hard choices. There were people, the Gandhians continued to manage it. Obviously, the scale at which it was required to happen in the earlier, I mean, you speak of primary education, one can also speak similarly of university education. Universities in this country are now completely broken system. Completely broken. So, those have suffered. Because with the structural adjustment program, for example, in the 80s, came the imperative to fund primary education because illiteracy was becoming an advance. So the larger sort of, how do you call it? But the money that came was earmarked, for example, for school education. As a result of it, then again university education. That's where money goes. If you wanted money to do steel production, then this much has to go into something else. So yeah, so yes, choices were made, and one can argue about them, but I think the leadership, both industrial, intellectual, and political, was very clear on.
Is the next generation not in the same league as these, or because of other reasons?
No, so I didn't touch on it because one would discuss it if one were to discuss the space program. Right? Like, he comes into his own in the 60s, very much so, but leaves the world very quickly after that. But if I was studying the space program, yes, of course I would have to The work that he did when he was in Bangalore together with Bhabha, he still didn't have his PhD then. He had to go back to English to defend his thesis. So yes, he's younger, but also that's not my research.
Because if you look in terms of success, I would say that the statistics and spaces which are probably given the most to in terms of interest in that.
Yeah. So I think Satish Dhawan is probably the person to speak most about that way, because I think I don't know if I'll ever get to do that. I mean, now you know, as I like to joke about it, and we'll probably going to say this again and again. For the last 6 years, I've been a construction and audit supervisor. So I don't know when I'll get back to writing this, but I think Satish Dhawan understood what it meant in the large project management, sequencing consequences for the Indian context, which is an extremely hard context. Because even today we have unemployable engineers, so on and so forth. So there's a range of problems that are very specific to us, that are specific to us, and every country has things like that. But he knew how to make it work, and I think he and his colleagues baked into the DNA of the institution the kinds of recruitment, some of which you actually find across industry. So you find it, for example, with the larger Tata enterprises, they always recruit from tier 2, tier 3 cities. So similarly with the space program, they recruit from tier 2, tier 3 cities, they also tier 2, tier 3 institutions, and not rely on institutions. Institutions will largely become investment bankers and go to the US, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's just I haven't studied the program enough. But I think Satish Dhawan to me is an interesting figure that I would study if I were.
So there is a reason I'm asking that counterfactual question, and maybe I'll explain the reason in a bit.
Sure.
So do you think if the Betatron had arrived,
Yeah.
we would not have had the nuclear program start that early?
It would happen because it came decisively. The discussion came to the table most decisively after the first time. Before that, it was also wishful thinking. There weren't enough people who were trained, there weren't enough facilities, there wasn't money. There were people who were willing to help. I mean, the Americans wanted to give reactors, we eventually went to the Canadians, but also the Soviet Union wanted to give us a reactor, research reactor, things like that. Things would have happened.
And would it have been Bhabha who would have done it, or would?
Difficult to say. See, he died in 66, and it was like Sarabhai again, a premature death in a sense, or an unanticipated death. And also close on the heels of the first Prime Minister, Jahnavi, and that what it meant was both the change of political regime, but also increase the leadership of the scientific establishment. And that shapes then the next generation and how they think about it, but also there's no discounting the guidance test. October 64, brings the discussion all India radio. So I think one way or the other it could happen. I mean, this question even German historians ask, right? Like, would there be a third Reich without Granada or Hitler? Yes, there would be. Not quite in the same shape, maybe not quite in the same form, because the situation was right for an implosion, political implosion. So yeah.
Okay. So, and the second question is about Mahalanobis. So, was he just more academically driven, and the things about development and the being part of the planning commission and so on, that just happened because it was the need of the government, or was there a push from his side as well, where he was very forward thinking in terms of, I have these methods, I have these tools that I really want to apply, and this is how I see as one application area. So was the push from the government side, or was it,
It's a hard one, right? Like, you can ask the same question of Hobi Baba, you can ask the same question
exactly.
of Santosh Nagar, you can ask the same question about a bunch of others.
Right? Like, my broadly question is, was it the vision of the government, or was it the vision of that one person?
Data was required. The imperial government had data, but it was useful for governance of a particular time. Right? And so data was required. He had the method. The world was coming to him to learn the method. And like they shaped the institution, they shaped the state, they shaped the nature of the state. And I think that's what's interesting. It's hard to kind of bring out the nuances of what it meant for state making, all that called electricity function in a short lecture. But they literally shaped how state agencies and therefore, as a consequence, also science gets conducted. Right? I'll come back to your question, but there's one observation I want to make before that. Because I'm reading a book called Government and Science in India at the moment. It's how it shapes is that one, the state became the biggest patron of science, right? And was at that point, remains to date. I mean, there is no private funding coming in now. There is nowhere at the scale at which the state funds science and engineering education. And also, then the accountability for that research is also set by bureaucratic norms. Like how does the state function? Basically, organizing protocols, and therefore, what you are in a way, as Jahnavi recently said about bureaucracy at large, you are responsible for compliance and not for outcomes. That will have consequences for how research is conducted. But your question is one of whether it was a protocol, and I think it's very hard to tell historically, right? Because it's a moment. It's a moment, and when there are people who have skills and the state requires them, right? Like, and there are certain disciplines in which that was required. If Indian independence came at the turn of the last century, meaning the late 19th to the early 20th, it would have been chemistry, right? Because that led in fact the second industrial revolution. So that, so it would have been chemical engineers, and we saw what Fitzhaber did for determining the First World War. So I think contingency is extremely important. So who meets what at what moment, and who's ready to meet it. And I think that discussion is very interesting also to see for the turn of this century, right? Because 1890-91 we saw the collapse of a particular collapse of the Cold War world order, and the rise of a new world order where everything that is presented as China, that's what it has meant for institutions and knowledge makers. We call it the knowledge economy. Here I'm kind of walking out on a limb because I haven't studied these institutions or these processes very carefully. But that's another change which we might actually dig because people are still alive and we might be able to talk to them. So it's the moment, who's ready to meet the moment, who has a vision that actually feeds the ambitions of the arrangement of power. The feed state, and it's no longer state power. Other kinds of.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. I mean, this was. So you touched upon the way the state interacted, or rather affected the way science developed in India. I was wondering if there have been studies done on the technology, on the technological aspects, on more of the industrial aspects of policies that developed. For example, the Indian Railways. Indian Railways also is something we inherited from the British in a sense, as a colonial structure and things, but clearly the needs after independence were very different from what they had. And are there studies, or have you done studies on the structural changes that took place in the Indian Railways, structurally, administratively, as well as technologically, to be where we are right now? I think, are there studies of that kind as well?
See, the unfortunate answer is no. I mean, there's a little bit. There's a scholar called Laura Baer. Yes, B-A-R. Laura Baer at the London School of Economics. He studied the Indian Railways somewhat carefully, but he's not a historian of technology. You'll still find some useful things there, but I mean, there are two aspects to an answer to a question like this. One is that most of my colleagues who do study history of science and technology are very, very happy studying the period age because there are proper archives. Right? You go to the British Library, you spend 2 months, you come back, you can write a book in the next 2 years. You start your project in the 1940s and you try to write anything after that. You have to beg, borrow, steal, do all sorts of things to get documents to be able to write history of the later time period. And I was extremely lucky to find people who were willing to share papers, including, for example, Aeronautics' son has his father's papers. I met him recently again, and they haven't given it to any archive, but for some reason they decided after meeting me several times that I was trustworthy, and so they would share those papers. I wouldn't have been able to write the Bangalore story without that trust at all, right? So it's very hard to write about transformation because and the second, so first is my colleagues are very happy, and I won't blame them because it's very hard to, at the end of the day, I mean, most of us don't take mad decisions like walking out on an acting job. You need your promotion. You need your, you need to continue. And you want to write. You want to, you want to do that work. But the other thing is also, I think, the history of, how should I put it? The concern with the state is also has become very unfashionable in the humanities, especially in the last 30, 40 odd years, 3 or 4 decades actually, because of several reasons. One of them can be laid at the feet of Mr. Foucault, not of the pendulum, but the other one, who, it was that we study the operations of power and state power in everyday life as opposed to studying the state itself, and therefore the study of state was relegated to political scientists and people who study public administration who wrote extremely dry texts about every organizing the state. Most uninteresting, it's very important, and I look at it, I got my first degree research in politics. It's very, very important to understand how the state is and how those agencies come about, because that has an impact. I mean, it operates through registers. What you are able to do in a lab and not able to do in a lab is decided elsewhere, or comes to be decided elsewhere, unless you are able to actually understand the mechanism of how this thing works. So, the study of the everyday state is very, very attractive, and the study of the state as a structure is less attractive, and that is one reason why we don't have such study. The study of science and technology, there is nowhere in this country where you can do a degree. That also has consequences, which means we are not fighting to maintain those archives, we are not fighting to create those archives. Again, I mean, it's not like a completely sort of monopolization, but it's sad enough. It could be much better. It needs to be much better.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the lecture. Ma'am, your study mostly focuses around pre and post-colonial times around science.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask, how do you see the development of nuclear technology in India shaping its national and international identity at the global level? And the second question is the Higgs boson particle that was discovered was one of the big moment in terms of particle physics at international level. So we were having that cold time era where people were competing each other for their scientific developments. So how do you see again as a historian of science, number of countries coming together to discover a particle like Large Hadron Collider experiment that happened? How do you see is the axis still with the Western hegemony in development of science, or is it more distributive in nature, as it is opening up?
In your question, for the first one, I think, as I alluded earlier, India was punching above its weight immediately after independence. 1955, the first Atoms of Peace meeting, where for the first time after the Second World War, the two sides, so to speak, were meeting across the Iron Curtain. And Homi Chandra Bhabha was presiding there. So it wasn't without value that India showed ambition in both creating the knowledge around experimental nuclear physics by encouraging particle accelerators and teams that could do it, but also, and of course, we had a research reactor by then, but also an interest in geopolitics around the question. Right? So because the Atoms of Peace was as much a scientific and actually as much, it was both a scientific and political meeting. There was no way to separate the two. There was no way to separate the two. So, I mean, and at the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Authority, IAEA, India played a huge role there too. So so how was India in a way participating but also reflecting larger concerns around the nuclear? I wouldn't call it research as well as geopolitics. Yes, I mean, India saw herself in political and academic leadership in India saw India as an integral part of the discussion and made sure that we were seeing the way. In terms of larger international collaborations, I think again we are still fairly resource strapped here. Or also, I don't know how to answer this question. It's very hard to answer contemporary questions. But I think what I can say with reasonable, what I can suggest as an informed opinion as opposed to a studied argument is bias, but the power still lies elsewhere in terms of being able to, do large-scale studies, fund large-scale studies, invite large groups to work together. We don't have a server ourselves. For that, even though it's a boson, so it's, but again, I wouldn't, it's not a question historians can have a answer on. Yes, please. Sorry, which leadership was there and not there? Okay.
Establishment or political leadership, and somebody else would have been there.
Yeah.
Would it be teleological or eventuality that we will lead or will reach where we were?
Yeah. So it's as you can yourself recognize, it's not an easy question to answer because there is no good answer to that question. Right? Like what kind of leader, who would be that leader? Right? So in some ways, I think the majority of the leaders, and what do I mean by majority of the leaders? Majority of the political leadership of the anti-colonial movement at that point of time was convening around the need to industrialize. So even if you look at the first provincial government, which is 1935, elected in 1937, they set up the national planning committee. Right? And the state inspiration, although not at all emulated entirely, right? Like completely modified way, the Soviet Union. Because in the 1920s, with Lenin's sort of industrialized or formula, primarily agrarian economy was transformed into a large-scale industry. And I think 1949 kind of gave everybody two things. The ability of the Soviet Union to fight the Second World War and put back on the German armies, as well as 1949 and the first test, gave the world the faith that you can actually turn around in over 3 decades a primarily agrarian economy into an industrial. Now the other thing that feeds into the discourse at this time is also the American, because the American New Deal is actually a plan, very much a plan. It's not a free market, open kind of encouragement for industrialization and the building of large dams and things like that. Right? So I think the New Deal and the Soviet experiment are both very important inspirations for the new provincial government. And the National Planning Committee, which was during the war, in fact, many of its writers included engineers and doctors and lawyers and scientists as well. Jahnavi was among them, but there were many others who wrote their reports between 1938 and 1945-46. The documents have no doubt in them that industrialization was the path. It's a very, very strongly negating the Gandhian commitment to the development of an agrarian village economy. So that, including, some of the reports are fairly fascinating. It's like the place of women in Indian economy, rivers and flood management, steel, railways, there's some 27 odd reports. And all of them, of course, unlike for my generation, they're all available online for anyone to see them now. So I think the argument in favor of industrialization was fairly strong. And so whether it was one person or another, unless that action, so to speak, of the anti-colonial movement that was completely defeated by another kind of action, how it was to be implemented could have been brought up. Right? Let's say if it was, say, Subhash Bose or something. There's no chance that there are no technology. But that aside, so the manner in which it would be implemented would have been probably different. But that industrialization was the path forward is not something that was contested strongly enough.
I was specifically in the context of nuclear program, as in nuclear, where because Nehru was the one who was really close with Meghnad Saha was there, also became member of parliament later perhaps.
Correct.
He was interacting with Mahala Bunis certainly, and Homi Baba had a close relationship. So this nuclear experimental physics, that thing, would have happened had it not been for. Of course, but the large scale TFI, centralization of, that would it have happened? That's the.
It happened globally. There's no reason to believe it might not have happened in India. It's of course, it's always difficult to say in counterfactually that yes, this only would have happened.
No. I'm not saying this only, but it looks like as of a teleological, it is eventuality. I'm saying perhaps, let's say if we had political leadership where Gandhian thought of non-violence and all sorts of ideologies that are there.
There was no discussion of the weapon until.
Of course, sure.
Until the early. So and even after 66, between 66 and 70, when Bhabha died and Sarabhai took over, Bhabha was even more explicit about non-violence. Bhabha was non-committal. Although Bhabha was non-committal, but Sarabhai was explicit about committal to non-violence. So it's a difficult one. Difficult one in the sense, difficult to answer like who would have done what. Like I said, I think unless I would find at this moment hard to imagine that a faction that was not committed to industrialization would have found itself in a position to gain enough control to form something. And therefore then.
Industrialization, yes, but the nuclear
research was happening even before the use of atomic bombs. I think it would have continued and it was mobilized towards a program, so to speak, starting only in the mid-60s. But it's also difficult thinking to say that about the period before that. There weren't enough people who knew it. There weren't enough resources. You need resources not only in terms of funding, but you also need resources in terms of quality.
Very different direction, but can you say a little bit about the science gallery and specifically, as in, I understood even from the website and all that there are science exhibits, maybe students come and do experiments, but how much of the science technology society and some of the things you spoke about, do the youth also engage with those kind of discourses or like anything that prompts them in that direction, or is it mostly about the science and technology?
I mean, there is no science and technology outside of society.
Right. No, but do they explicitly, because what we learn in schools, it's, it's very
close-ended.
It's in vacuum and all that.
No, I mean, in an exhibition that would be very hard to do. In a science center, you can do that, right? Like where you can sort of put your hand on a plate and learn about a few things, push a few buttons and do over. But not in an exhibition. There it's harder. And there, worldwide it's harder. The Smithsonian has had to pull down several exhibitions because people came and protest. I'm hoping that will not. That was for Inola Bay, the aircraft. But no, so my team and I, we do embed history in our exhibition. So when we did an exhibition on plants, for example, we had J.C. Bose, Jahnavi, and their research and their history. So the new exhibition that opened last weekend is about Bangalore and so it's probably the most historical exhibition we've done. This is the 7th exhibition that we have. It's probably the most historical. It is the most historical one we're doing, and I don't think we'll ever do any that historical. So yes, it does. I mean, yes, So history is embedded in the narrative, but it's not. The goal is not to bring history into the public domain as much as it is to deliver, in many ways, the same thing that I tried to do in my research, which is, if I were to just boil it down to one phrase, how do you provide insights into processes of knowledge production? And I think both in history writing as well as in the exhibition, that's the goal I have, and that's what. And it's meant for a sort of slightly older audience. It's not children we work with, but young adults. Industry going, and I think that way, not really going to be.
We appreciate your time and expertise. I would request Professor B. Manjunath to present a memento on behalf of our community. Thank you all for participating today. Please join us for the refreshment section.